Welcome to Al Ginkgo, your virtual campfire talk with fellow eclectics, kindling knowledge synthesis.
On our way to be recorded here, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. May it please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us clarity of thought as we again do what is important, and that is to discuss the things of al-Islam to the best of our ability and to coordinate that knowledge and that discussion with our knowledge of al-Quran. So, with that being said, brother, there's something before we push on towards the Ottoman. I really want to get there, but there's so many stones left unturned before we get to that big one that I want to take us through again the latter part of the Dark Ages into the glorious period of the middle part of Islam's history here, its golden age, and also what left, how that affected what became the Renaissance and whatnot. But before we go there, something has come up in one of my discussions with another fellow with regard to Imam Malik and his relationship to Jum'ah in Medina, of all places, you see. Now, I think we discussed here, and I know I have in other places, about the fact that, well, we don't have the Prophet's sermons. If he gave khutbah, we don't have any indication that he did so. That's an assumption, a historical assumption. It makes sense that if khutbahs were to be given and Jum'ah is what we believe it to be, then he would have given upwards of 400 sermons during the time that he was there in Medina as the leader, the Caliph, if you will, of Medina, that constitution, that sort of little budding nation state in the island, as an island oasis, if you will, in the desert of northern Arabia there. But we don't have them. And then other apologetics have said, oh, well, he didn't give khutbahs. He recited Quran. Oh, well, that's also wonderful. Okay. So we don't need to have those recitations because we have Al-Quran. So then why is everybody preoccupied with Hadith? Let's just focus on the Quran because that's what the Prophet did. That's his Sunnah, if that argument's to be accepted. So, okay, that's step one. Step two. Now let's go to Imam Malik. I'm informed, and I don't know this, and it's only the people who can read the Arabic treatises on the subject. I've been informed by those who can that Imam Malik, for the last 25 years of his life as the rector of the Medina School of Islamic Thought, if you will, did not attend Jum'ah. Now, if this is true, he must have had reasons for that. Okay, so that's step number three. Before we go on into discussing of rationalists in the later part of the Dark Age and leading into the Renaissance, I'm sure they existed, and we can just put that on the back seat, not the back shelf, but the back seat for right now. What can you tell us of what it is that you know and you understand about Imam Malik, his school of jurisprudence, and why it is that he did not attend Jum'ah for the last 25 years of his life, dear brother? Can you shed any light on that whatsoever? Inshallah.
Yes, thank you, Brother Omar, once again for sharing, giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts with you and your viewers. Before I begin, may I just do my customary little
Of
dua?
course.
Yes, thank you. Well, the moment you mentioned Imam Malik, the first thing that popped into my mind is something that my former boss and mentor, Professor Dr. Muhammad Hashim Kamali, one time said about Imam Malik in one of our meetings with the research fellows. He said that, among other things, Imam Malik is known for having said the following words 25 times altogether in his life. And the words are actually 3 words, and they are, I quote verbatim, "I don't know." In other words, he admitted to not knowing. That sounded very Socratic, if you ask me, because Socrates,
Yes, of
as you
course.
know, was known as the so-called wisest man in Greece. And when people ask me, well, what is it that you know that other people don't? And he said basically that, well, I know that I don't know. I am aware of my ignorance, while the other people don't know that they don't know, so to speak. So now, following in the footsteps of Imam Malik, even though I'm not a Maliki, I don't subscribe to any particular mazhab, but I'm also tempted to say, in answer to your question, to use that quotation and also say, I don't know. And as I mentioned last time, in fact, in our last discussion, remember your question about Ramadan, I had to excuse myself from attempting to answer it. Due to my, I have admittedly, humble, modest exposure to this question, although I do have friends who have delved into it quite extensively on Clubhouse in particular. So when faced with a question that one is not sure of the answer, I suppose it is safer to remain quiet. And if I'm not mistaken, there is even a hadith which says that keeping silent is half of the wisdom. So I'm not sure whether I have your permission to keep silent on this question or not, but I will share. I will share what I know, what I recall from my studies. Although I myself personally have been, people ask me, well, what is your approach, Mr. Abdul Karim, when you write these, when you put this, you write about these topics, and so what is your methodology, And I answered pretty much. I have to admit, I asked myself the same question more than once. What exactly is my approach? What is my methodology? And I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I am relying on the methodology that I have learned under my former teachers. I refer to them as the friends of Leo Strauss. And Leo Strauss, as you know, he used a methodology that his students refer to as CTA, or close textual analysis, which means that they take a piece of text, sometimes even a single word, and they analyze it at great depth. So I recall that when I used to write my papers in graduate school on political theory for my teachers, and all of them, I had 3 from the Friends of Leo Strauss. All of them, basically expected us, the students, to take a passage from a particular thinker, analyze it, maybe a paragraph, 5 or 6 sentences, or even less, and look at it from every possible angle and write a 20-page long paper about it, a kind of exegesis, a tafsir, if you like. And when I mentioned to Professor Kamali one time during a break in a conference that we were both attending, that this was Strauss's approach, and that it was actually what someone told me was the rabbinical approach, the way the rabbis used to read the Torah, you see, and that's what Strauss learned apparently in his youth. However, he took this method of reading, method of careful reading, meticulous reading, and he applied it not to the Torah, but rather to the works of the major Western philosophers, like Spinoza, Machiavelli, and others, you see. So I basically also, having been trained in that methodology, we were always looking for consistency in the text that we were interpreting, and certain things were no, like contradictions and what have you, ambiguity. So I would describe my methodology, apart from referring to it as a kind of close textual analysis, as a conceptual framework, because I do not basically delve into the individual work of the scholars. But rather, I look at the principles that they have distilled from their work, and let me give you an example. For example, the principle that the Sunnah judges the Qur'an, you see, which is a fundamental pillar of traditional exegesis. basis, as-sunnah
Mm-hmm.
qadiya ala Qur'an. So, and then I compare such a statement with what I read in the Quran. And when I see a discrepancy between the two, what the Quran says and what the scholars say, I say, okay, we have a contradiction here, inconsistency. So what are we going to do now? Of course, we cannot reject the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we have to reject the scholar, or at least let's use a softer expression. We have to set the scholarly perception aside, set it aside. And we have to say, well, no, we cannot allow the Sunnah to judge over the Quran, because the Quran is a more authoritative document than the Sunnah or the Hadith, because the Quran are the words of Allah, while the Hadith are the words of human beings. Nevertheless, this principle has been deeply embedded, in traditional classical Islamic tafsir. I think it was originated by some fellow called Auzai, who I think died in Beirut, and there's even some shrine there, or maybe where he is buried. You can visit that place if you want to, of course. So. And I take this approach and I apply it to other things, like, for example, the concept of jihad al-talab, aggressive warfare, and I look for these discrepancies. So, but in terms of Imam al-Malik, to come back to the question, I understand that Imam al-Malik would give preference to the practice of the people of Medina over certain hadiths. So he was not really that focused on the hadiths. As far as your question is whether he attended the Jummah prayers, I have no idea. Here I really have to quote him. I don't know. However, I can mention that the idea that people who do not go to congregational prayers deserve to be killed is an idea that is a concept that is taught at Al-Azhar University, and it is based partly on one of the 40 hadiths of Imam al-Nawawi. So what I'm trying to say is that I think his reluctance to rely on the hadith, in some cases is quite legitimate. And I don't want to get into too much into the intricacies of the hadith science. I will simply note that even contemporary Muslim ulama, Sunni ulama, have noted a serious weakness in the so-called traditional science of hadith, which is that the scholars basically ignored one very important criterion for determining the authenticity of the hadith, and that is its meaning. The matan is the Arabic terms. They focus almost exclusively on the isnad, or the chain of narration, and if the chain of narration struck them as reliable, they would characterize it as a Sahih hadith, even if its meaning clearly contradicted the Quran. Now, to me, I'm sorry to say, this is a very problematic methodology, and I don't think that this whole hadith science has to be revised. In fact, I don't even agree with the classification of how they arrive at classifying a hadith sahih or authentic. You see, to me, for a hadith to be authentic or sahih, I would go with the al-Kalam, the mutakallimun, and who basically would not. Well, first of all, they would not accept any hadith, but let me put it this way, I'd lean closer towards the view of Abu Hanifa, who, according to a book by Daniel Brown called Rethinking Tradition in Islam, according to Daniel Brown, not to be confused with Jonathan Brown, according to Daniel Brown, Abu Hanifa would only accept verbatim hadith. In other words, for him to take a hadith and to use it, it would have to be the exact words of the Prophet. Now, how many of such hadiths do we have? To my knowledge, we don't have any. We actually, the way I argue it in our discussions on Clubhouse, I say that as far as I can see, we only have one Sahih hadith, or authentic hadith, and which is verbatim, and that is the Quran. The Quran, in fact, refers to itself as the best hadith, and it refers to itself as the best Ahsanul Hadith and Ahsanul Tafsir, the best tafsir. So I basically support the approach to interpreting the Quran that was also supported by, for example, Muhammad Abdul, who argued in favor of interpreting the Quran by the Quran. This is called Tafsir al-Quran bil Quran, and that is That should be our approach to the Quran, plus some other assumptions. Every assumptions in our methodology has to be consistent with the teaching of the Quran. If we, as Muslims believe that the Quran is the word of Allah, and if we believe that Allah tells us the truth, we have to accept that every statement without exception in the Quran is the truth. So we cannot, for example, assert that the Quran contains ambiguous verses or ambiguous sentences because Allah tells us that it is a clear book without ambiguity. And but this is part of the traditional approach. It is said that, well, some verses are unclear or some words are unclear. In fact, the Shafis and the Hanafis, according to a book by Shukriya Hussain Ramich, 2005, Islamic Text Society, the book is called Language and the Interpretation of Islamic Law. The Shafis and the Hanafis developed a very elaborate system of classifying words. If I recall correctly, the Hanafis have up to 10 categories of words, and the Shafis have 6 categories. They both share the common category that they share is, first they divide all the words into clear and unclear, and then the Hanafis divide the clear words into 4 types and the unclear words into 4 types also, while the Shafis, divide the clear words into 2 categories and the unclear words into 2 more categories. So I think this whole classification of words into so many categories is unnecessary, and it unnecessarily complicates and clouds the picture, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself only categorizes the verses in the Quran, and perhaps we can say expressions, including words, into only 2 categories, the muhkamat and the mutashabihat. So now, actually, a friend recently alerted me, in that last video that he did, he wrote some comments, and I looked at one of them. I haven't had a chance to answer the remaining 3. But he claims, for example, that the word mutashabihat does not mean allegorical. I beg to disagree. And I gave him a reference to Corpus Quran, to the word mutashabihat in Surah 3, verse number 7. And there, in that word by word analysis, the word mutashabihat is rendered clearly as allegorical. However that may be, we can return to that at another time, but the majority opinion seems to be that the Quran contains some words or verses that only Allah can understand. I don't agree with that. I follow the opinion here of Mujahid, who, according to Muhammad Asad, in his commentary on the verse number 7 in Surah Imran, the 3rd surah, Mujahid apparently claims that the way the sentence should be read was that no one knows their meaning, the mutashabihat, except Allah and those well-versed in knowledge. So those well-versed in knowledge can also understand the so-called allegorical or metaphorical, if you prefer, verses. So those metaphorical words or verses, for example, they refer to things like the hand of Allah or the face of Allah. So the hand of Allah, we don't take it literally, but we interpret it as signifying, the power of Allah, along those lines. So, and we encourage not to focus too much on the allegorical or the mutashabihat verses, because yes, they can be interpreted more than one way, the literal way and the metaphorical way, and we could run into trouble if we are not careful with this distinction. But what I'm trying to say is, to come back to Imam Malik, is that Imam Malik's mazhab is one of the smaller mazhabs. The 2 biggest ones, I guess, are the Hanafis and the Shafis and the Hanbalis. So to come back to the original question, did Imam Malik attend, the congregational prayers? I really cannot tell. So I'm sorry that I have to, I don't know, how do I put this? In America, you have this 5th Amendment. No, is it the 5th Amendment? The right to remain silent. Can I plead the 5th Amendment? Even though I'm not American, I'm Canadian, perhaps I can plead, that maybe you will allow me to plead the 5th Amendment, so to speak. But I really don't know, but I'm certainly willing to look into it. And if I find any information...
as an American here, I have no choice but to grant you that privilege.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, it's an interesting question, but because I do have friends on Clubhouse who dispute that. They dispute that. In fact, one of them made it to the top of a blacklist that some Sunni brothers have made about us and sisters. They are calling us Hadith rejectors, and this list is circulating on Clubhouse. I was quite upset. Some of our brothers and sisters who made it, on that list are upset, but for a different reason. They thought that they were given the ranking too low. They felt that they deserved a higher place than what they got. Yeah,
there was one answer that was proposed to one of my readers, who said that Imam Malik did not attend the last 25 years of his life. He previously attended, apparently, but during the last 25 years of his life, and there are some indications of letters written by Imam so-and-so and such, that he did not attend the last 25 years of his life. And one reader has suggested that he did not attend because it would have put his life in jeopardy by the Sultan at the time, because had he taken the minbar at that, whatever that social gathering was that we called Jum'ah, there's always a political implication one way or another, some sort of social political implication, because Islam does not separate itself from the hand of Allah, the political power, if you will. So had he taken the minbar, he would have to criticize the Sultan, and that would have placed his life in danger, you see. So that's a valid excuse, but no one seems to be able to confirm that. Others have confirmed, using letters written by others as historical evidence, that he did not attend. Whatever the case might be, let's move on from that question. I allow the fifth here, okay? You don't know, or you don't want to say, but I'm accepting the fact that you don't know.
I really don't know, brother. I really don't know.
So that is that's a valid perspective, and it's also a wise thing not to comment. The reason I bring this up is because, well, it's there, it's on the table, and people are in fact discussing this, and it's currently brought back up in several discussions, including by this fellow Dr. Hani, who has the marvelous Quran.com and is doing his own revisionist work, which some of it is really quite remarkable. Now, let's move on then to, if you can, some of the Malikite principles of jurisprudence. Did he attend to this sword raising, jihad that was accepted by others? Did he oppose it? What was his position there, and on this and perhaps some other matters, if you could, inshallah?
Sure. Yeah, before I touch on that question, I would just like to mention something from my personal experience.
Sure.
I don't want to identify the person by name, but he was a close friend of mine, a highly learned scholar, and occupied a leading position here in Malaysia at Malaysian, more than one Malaysian university. And he shared with me once personally that he doesn't like to go to Juma because of the khutbahs that he hears over there, you see. And I myself can share, I had a similar experience. I noticed that in some khutbahs which I attended, the imam, began to quote hadith, which struck me as problematic. Like one example I can give is when he quoted that hadith that on Yawmul Qiyamah, the day of accountability, every tree will shout to the Prophet and say something to the effect, "Ya Prophet, come and kill the Jew hiding behind me." You see, I don't know if you have heard about that hadith.
Yes, I've heard that one.
that is a very problematic, problematic tradition attributed to the Prophet, and it's completely alien to the spirit and letter of the Quran. As we know, the Prophet himself, in his constitution of Medina, in the city-state of Medina, granted the Jews practically full rights. They were part of the Ummah, you see. So this type of hadith, how do I put it? Well, they are quite anti-Semitic, right?
Yes.
And I don't think we should go down that rabbit hole, because Islam is a universal religion. It doesn't discriminate against any minority, and even I think there's even a hadith to that effect, that it is not ethnicity that makes people different from one another, but it's the taqwa, that if you want to make any distinctions between people, then you should look at their piety or God consciousness or taqwa. And also Allah says in Surah 49, we have made you into nations and tribes so that you may know one another, not that you may despise one another. So as Muhammad Shahrur noted in his book, Quran, Morality and Critical Reason, unfortunately, some of the traditional ulama stripped, I think that's the word he uses, Islam of its universality. And that is very sad, and made it appear quite parochial and tribalistic, and a lot of culture appears to have entered into people's consciousness or awareness of Islam through the hadiths, basically, some of the hadiths, or perhaps not all. But now to come back to your question about Imam Malik's fiqh, if I recall correctly, Imam Malik was reluctant to use the solitary hadiths because he didn't consider them to be a strong enough evidence to, so he would rely, I believe, on mutawatir hadiths. And in some cases, he would, disregard certain hadiths if they, I was reading this in a book by Tajabir Alwani called Reviving the Balance. He was going into this in some detail. So, but the overall picture from what I can recollect is that Imam Malik would often give preference to the practice of the people of Medina over the hadiths, you see. So he didn't value and follow the hadiths as much as for someone like Shafi did, or even Ibn Hanbal, you see. As you know, Al-Shafi basically, how do I put it, elevated or designated the hadith as a second source of legislation, which I think is problematic, because there are verses in the Quran which say, La hukmu illa lillah, only Allah can judge in matters of religion, you see. But what has happened with this, I've been through this before. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but because of the desire to use the traditions to quote unquote interpret or elucidate the Quran, this is the word that Tajabir Alwani uses. He tries to steer clear of using the word clarifying the Quran, because after all, the Quran presents itself as the clarifying book. So and it is the book that contains clear evidence. So when traditional Sunni Mufassirun are telling us that we have to clarify the Quran using the hadith, I think they are putting the horse before the cart, and they are reversing the proper relationship between the Quran and the Sunnah. The Sunnah does not judge on the Quran. On the contrary, it is the Quran that judges the Sunnah. And this was a mistake made, for example, by Dr. Jonathan Brown in a discussion about the Sunnah. And he basically reiterated the traditional position that, yes, the Sunnah judges the Quran, and yes, that the Quran needs the Sunnah more than the Sunnah needs the Quran, which I think are really very, very problematic statements, and they are at the heart of the problems in traditional, exegesis and later jurisprudence, because what happened as a result of elevation, the designation or treatment of the Hadith or the Sunnah to Al-Shafi, they are the same. The Sunnah is the same as the Hadith. Now, to people like Malik, I think he differentiates between the Sunnah and the Hadith. But anyway, the moment you make the Sunnah or the Hadith as a Wahi or second revelation, they had a name for it, Wahi Batin, I think I mentioned it, the hidden revelation, compared to the Wahi Zahir of the Quran, the explicit or manifest revelation. The moment you make the Hadith equal to the Quran, you have fallen into what I'm suggesting we could call scriptural shirk, right?
Yes.
Because you are saying that the Quran has a partner. Bukhari becomes a partner as a text to the Quran and all the other Hadith books. And we even have people like Ibn Baz telling us openly, publicly on his website that the Sunnah is a part of the Quran and that the Sunnah is inseparable from the Quran. These are verbatim quotes from his, verse, from his post. And I have even seen other scholars, and I don't want to mention any names because I don't want to embarrass anyone, but other scholars say also that even the tafsir becomes part of the Quran. So goodness, I know it's unbelievable. So now these people are mixing the words of human beings with the words of God. They are amalgamating the words of human beings with the words of God. They are treating them as equal, and sometimes they even treat the words of human beings as superior to the words of God. This is even more outrageous. And we have examples of that, as I mentioned. I keep coming back to these examples. The 3 death penalties for apostasy, adultery, and blasphemy all come from traditions, and they all overrule the Quran because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not prescribe the capital punishment for any of these transgressions. In fact, 2 of them they are all punishable, but the 2 of them, apostasy and blasphemy, are punishable only in the hereafter, not in this life. You know how the Prophet used to respond to the insults that he used to receive. He would just, ignore it, and he would not retaliate, to these insults. In fact, I remember there's one story, one hadith, I think it's a true hadith, but where some woman was placing obstacles in his way every time he walked by her house. And then one day there were no obstacles in his path, so he went to inquire, and he found out that the woman was sick, and I think he went in and actually offered to help her. You see, so this is how he responded to the evil that was aimed at his way. And in fact, he was following the verse in Al-Quran where Allah says, if someone does something bad to you, do something good to them, and you will see as if by a miracle you will have become like childhood friends. And that's exactly what he also did with the Quraysh of Makkah when he was returning, going to Makkah at the head of an army of 10,000 armed men, and he could have easily taken the city by force if he wanted to, but instead what he did was he did something good to his former enemies. He gave them a general amnesty, saying, I forgive you guys. And on top of, except for a few especially drastic cases, which, as I mentioned, reminds me of the Nuremberg trials when the Nazis were also tried for war crimes. So there was a general amnesty. There's some difference of opinion as to how many people were exempted from this amnesty. And on top of the general amnesty, he even sent gifts to the leaders of the Quraysh, gifts to his very enemies, you see. So, and what happened as a result? Well, there was no fighting, no blood was shed, except perhaps for the punishment for those few extremely violent individuals. And the people of Makkah were reunited, reconciled with the people of Medina. And as I pointed out in one of my books, I think it's online on academia, it's a paper on leadership. In this, he demonstrated his real sunnah and showed us how to reconcile conflicts between parties. And there's even one hadith according to which the Prophet allegedly said, shall I tell you something which is better than fasting, zakat, and praying? And they said, well, what is that? And he said, it is to make peace between people who are fighting, you see. So he was, as Edip Yüksel would probably put it, a peacemaker. To Edip Yüksel, a Muslim is a peacemaker. Islam is about peace. It is not about war. So what I'm trying to say is that, as I said, Imam Malik was more focused on the Sunnah than the Hadith, and frequently he would disregard Hadith, and specifically the solitary Hadith, which, by the way, constitute the majority of the Hadith in our collections. The Mutawatir Hadiths are quite few in number, and even they cannot be completely trusted, because as Edip Yüksel, for example, points out, we have 3 examples of 3 Mutawatir Hadiths, and they are all different. These Mutawatir Hadiths go back to the last sermon of the Prophet, where he said that according to one rendition, I'm leaving you the Quran. In a second version of the Mutawatir Hadith, he is reported as having said, I'm leaving you the Quran and my Sunnah. Now, that is also, as thousands of people apparently heard him say, so how come we have two conflicting, renditions? And then there's a third one, the Shia version, which says that, well, the Prophet allegedly said, I'm leaving you the Quran and the way of the Ahlul Bayt. So now we have three mutawatir hadiths. They are all conflicting with each other. Allegedly, they were heard by thousands of people. So where's the consensus here? I would like to know. If somebody can help me out here, I would be very thankful. So I would say that even the mutawatir hadiths are very problematic. And the whole concept of tawatur, I think, is also problematic because, for example, we know that among the Christians, the concept of Trinity has been handed down through tawatur from generation to generation, I think more than a millennium, and yet it doesn't make it right that it has come down to us through, transmission by very large numbers of people. And of course, in Islam, we also have the practice of genital mutilation of not just females but males too. So now this has also come down to us through tawatur. So can we trust the tawatur? Allah has prohibited even the cutting of the ears of camels in the Quran. What more, defiling the physical nature? Do these people think that they can create better than Allah when they, start doing surgery on people and making improvements on the people? This is outrageous. I think it is a crime, actually, personally, this abhorrent practice. But anyway, I think in the UK it is actually illegal to do to carry on this practice of genital mutilation, and in the United States the trend is decreasing. That fewer and fewer people are having this, practicing this. So once again, to come back to Imam Malik is that what I would conclude is to say that yes, he relied mostly on he would often set aside solitary hadiths and go with the practice of the people of the Medina. And if he did use hadith, I think he used mostly the hadith that would be thought of as the mutawatir. In other words, hadith that come with multiple chains of isnad or narration or transmission. Thank you.
Well, thank you. My next question is directly related to what you just said. Well, if he followed these select hadith, very select, and even had trouble with those, then his other recourse was to follow the customs of the people of Medina. Well, how do we know what those customs were? I mean, he obviously knew what they were because they were, he lived there and amongst the people of Medina and could observe as a primary witness what the people of Medina did. And for how many generations were they doing this particular thing? What do we know of those customs? Has he left us a record? Has anybody left us a record?
Yeah, that's a good question, brother. I fear that it is a highly specialized question. If you like, I could read up on it, and if you want to come back to this question, after I do my homework, so to speak.
Sure.
We can delve into it at some depth. At the moment, I'm focusing in my research on this idea that is, of so-called elucidation of the Quran by the Hadith, which Tajabir Alwani also supports. But this idea of the methodology of Imam Malik is, this would be interesting, I suppose, to pursue. There's a book by Abu Zahra, The Four Imams, and he probably has, a fair bit to say about, the practices of Imam Malik. I think the book is quite well received and well regarded. So that might be one place to look, for additional. But I agree that it's very difficult to ascertain. How do you know the practice of a certain people? Because history is notoriously unreliable.
Yes.
You see.
Yes,
And
that's why I'm asking the question.
Generally, when there's a war, usually the victors get to write the history of what happened, and the people who lose, like even in Islamic intellectual history, we have the people, Mutazilites, who were the rationalists, who were persecuted, and many of their works were destroyed, and some of the people were also destroyed. So this is but there's some evidence coming up, and I think even in the debates that Imam al-Shafi used to have with the so-called rationalists, the Ahlul al-Rai, the people of opinion, people like Abu Hanifa and others, Even here, I think there has been some distortion in the
Mm-hmm.
account of what really happened, because I'm increasingly inclined to the opinion, to the view that the so-called clashes between the rationalists, the Ahlul al-Rai, and the traditionists, the Ahlul Hadith, would probably be better represented as a clash between the Ahlul Quran and the Ahlul Hadith. The real debate was, I think, not as much about the role of reason, in interpreting revelation, but rather the role of the Quran and the Sunnah in relation to each
Mm-hmm.
other. A lot of the stuff that Imam al-Shafi'i wrote in his Risala were attempts to criticize the al-Kalam, the Mutakallimun, who held the view that the Quran was the primary, source of knowledge about Islam, and in fact that following the Quran was basically to understand the Sunnah of the Prophet requires us to understand the Sunnah as consisting mainly, if not exclusively, in following the Quran. So according to this view, the Prophet himself, you might say, was the first Qur'anist, if you like, or the first Quran-only person, or the first
Mm-hmm.
Quran-centric person. Obviously, he did not follow Bukhari, did he? He did not follow Tirmidhi, did he? He did
No.
not follow Sahih Muslim. These are all man-made narrations. And
Mm-hmm.
if you ask me, quite frankly, but I'm willing to be corrected, the Prophet didn't even know about these, books. So anybody who follows these books of traditions and considers them as anything more than historical information about the past, at best as a source of
Yes.
hikmah, non-binding hikmah, and non-legal,
Mm-hmm.
not as and not as
Right.
revelation, not as legislation, and not as binding, and not as interpreting the Quran. If you just want to find some wisdom in it, okay, for example, if somebody wants to know which foot do I have to use to enter the bathroom, you will find the answer in the hadith.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, that is not a very important question, you see.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I think that the real debate was between the Ahlul Quran and Ahlul Hadith, but of course the Ahlul Quran were in many cases there was a significant degree of overlap between the people of the opinion
Mm-hmm.
and the people of the Ahlul Quran, because even as I mentioned, Imam Abu Hanifa would only accept verbatim Hadith, so he was also focused mainly on the Quran. Yeah,
Yes.
so and the rationalists, they are arguing we need to use our akal, our reason, and for what purpose? Well, for understanding the Quran, you see. And I don't
Yes.
think they were using it to understand the Sunnah or the Hadith. And the Mutazilites were known as rationalists, and they also had great reservations about using the Hadith as a source of revelation, as looking at it as revelation or a source of legislation or something binding. At best, the Hadith should
Mm-hmm.
be considered something, the good Hadith, I mean the ones that are in agreement with the Quran, at best they can be considered as something that is recommended rather than required. In other words,
Yes.
as Sunnah, we talk about people doing a couple of Sunnah rakat. It is recommended, but it is not required. It is not binding. And here
Mm-hmm.
also Shahrur expresses a similar opinion. I think that even
Yes.
Tahajabir Rawani, who is a Sunni scholar, is coming
Mm-hmm.
around to that opinion. I remember reading in his
Yes.
book, which I referred to earlier, that the hadith should have never been written down. This is coming from a
Yes.
Sunni scholar. He says
Yes.
it should
Yes.
have been left in oral form. Now, this is amazing. You
Well,
see, so
I
there's a
I
lot of.
recently
Yeah, go ahead.
I recently excuse me. I recently heard that Abu Bakr had a book that he destroyed, and one of the other caliphs had a book, and they destroyed that as well for this very reason. And so, what you're discussing here and what you're trying to emphasize for our listeners, as well as myself, is well, we have the word of God versus the word of man. Okay. And I'm sure that these early scholars, for example, Imam Malik, must have considered this when he came to the decision, well, I'm not going to accept these hadith. Well, this is the word of man and it's hearsay. And as a jurist, he would have known firsthand from primary experience that people often forget what so and so said. 5 minutes after they said it, they rephrase it, and the meaning of the thing can be completely changed or significantly modified. So, That leaves us with the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as it's recorded in the Quran. So these men must have sat there, people like Malik and others, and said, okay, well, how do I know that the Quran is in fact the word of God? A legitimate question. How do I know? I mean, I wasn't there. I didn't meet Jibril, so I couldn't be impressed by that angelic presence. All I can be impressed by is, well, there's a word of mouth evidence that he certainly made some sort of appearance and began to dictate this wonderful kitab. Okay, so how did these scholars at that time, at that early age, come to the conclusion that, in fact, Al Quran is the word of God? Now, I have some reasons for that conclusion myself as a medical doctor and scientist, but these people didn't necessarily have that kind of scientific information. If you want to discuss the Quran's revelation of the development, the embryonic development in the womb, it's right there, and science is borne it out. And you can say, well, how is it that the prophet, a man in the desert, could, without a microscope and without any medical technology or training, discern this and then record it for posterity? Well, that's an evidence there that there's something else going on here than just some sort of religious, imaginative faculty. Okay, it's way beyond that. How did these people come to the conclusion that the Quran, and I'm talking about not just Malik, but the Quranists themselves, how did they come to the conclusion that the Quran was its own interpreter, not just because the book said it, but because there's some evidence, you see, that this is so, and that the Quran is in fact divinely inspired? We can, the Christians claim this, the Jews claim it about their books, but they've been so corrupted, you see, you can easily discern where it is that the word of man entered and made interpolations. And you can say, well, this is obviously not a divine inspiration. And this also pertains to the Gospels, which they claim are to be divinely inspired, which they're not. There's certain elements of wisdom in it, but the Quran is a completely different book. And how is it that these men sitting there in the desert around their little oases and campfires and their discussions of this matter, how did they come to the conclusion without meeting Jibril? See, how did they come to the conclusion that this was, in fact, an inalterable, unaltered word of divine inspiration? Word, W-O-R-D, okay? The Christians say word made flesh. We can say word made script here. So how did this happen? Why did they decide? Why did Malik take this Quranist position? He must have had reasons.
Yes, and obviously the reasons are given in the Quran itself. You see, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself challenges us that if we do not believe that this Quran is from him, he challenges us to produce not the whole Quran like it, but 10 surahs like it. Or then he lowers it down to even one surah. And he says that we would never be able to produce anything comparable. And I agree, no one has produced anything comparable. Like I myself, I have had the privilege of getting some exposure to the so-called best of the West in terms of philosophy and literature. And I've, looked at most of the major classics, whether in philosophy or literature. And I can assure you, as Allah is my witness, that nothing really comes close to the Quran, in terms of its beauty, the aesthetics of it, in terms of its ethics, the ethical content. And let's remember also that the Arabs used to have a penchant for poetry. I think they still do. Yes. They were admired for beautiful recitation. And here comes the Quran, which is actually a very beautiful recitation.
Mm-hmm.
And but it has a content which is different from the poets that the poetry that they used to recite.
Mm-hmm.
So the Quran had an immense impact, I think, on the Arab community of the time, and later, of course, on the rest of the world. So I would say, and this question also comes up in our clubhouse discussions. Our Sunni brothers and sisters ask us, well, how do you know this is from Allah? Well, I say, I know that it's from Allah because I see this is a perfect document, you see, inimitable. The notion of the characteristic or attribute of the ijaza of the Quran, the inimitability, it cannot be reproduced, I think is quite striking. But unfortunately, what happened, as I was having a discussion with one of my friends on Clubhouse, some of the ulama actually took up the challenge that Allah has given us, come up with at least 10 surahs
Mm-hmm.
and 1 surahs.
Mm-hmm.
And they came up not just with 1 surah or 10 surahs or even 1 Quran, 1 book of Revelation. They kind of upped the ante on Allah, and they produced, believe it or not, are you ready for this? 100 books of Revelation.
Wow.
And I'm referring to the 100. What I'm referring to here is the entire corpus of Hadith books, because if you include Hadith books, there are 60, approximately 60 books of Hadith among us in the Sunni tradition, and another 40 books of Hadith in the Shia tradition. So I'm not going to comment on Shia books, but definitely the mainstream Sunni position about the Hadith that it is revelation and even equal to the Quran. Let me quote the verse that, not a verse, but the alleged hadith that Ibn Baz has on his website. And it is a famous hadith in which the Prophet allegedly said, I quote, I was given 2 things, the Quran and something equal to it, the hadith in brackets.
Okay.
So, in other words, and it is a standard Sunni position that the hadith is also revelation. And some other scholars like Alwani, they quote that hadith in a slightly different form. They will say that the Prophet allegedly said, I was given 2 things, the Quran and something similar to it, the hadith.
Mm-hmm.
No, the Arabic word is mithlihi, so similar perhaps is a closer rendition, but still. So what I'm trying to say is that the ulama claim that they have produced this secondary revelation based on certain misinterpretation of certain verses, like the verse in Al-Quran where Allah says that he doesn't speak of his own desire, it is by the revelation revealed, you see. But that verse was a reference to the Quran when he when he speaks as a messenger rather than as a prophet. It was not intended to be a reference to everything else that Muhammad said including what he said in his capacity as a prophet. So what I'm trying to say is that I think the primary reason why I, at least on my part, take the hadith to be, the Quran to be the word of God is because I do not find anything comparable. In fact, if you look at, and didn't Allah promise to preserve the Quran? But the Quran, the recital, he didn't, to my knowledge, promise to preserve the Mus'haf, which is the written transcript of the Quran. So we need to differentiate between the two. And he definitely did not promise to preserve the hadith, as far as I know. And when you look at the content of the hadith, somebody even asked me on Clubhouse, how do you know that the hadiths are not verbatim? Well, I told him, look, you have the same hadith, sometimes in several different forms. Like I already mentioned the example of the mutawatir hadith. This is also true about other hadiths, that they are narrated in different ways by different people. So please don't expect me to believe that these are verbatim narrations. And as you said, what we have here, the hadiths, in fact, in principle, amount to, can we say they amount to anything more than hearsay? These are basically rumors. People talk about Chinese whispers. Indeed, when I say something to person B and he says it to person C and person D, by the time it gets to the 8th person, it's something completely different, and it could be completely opposite of what. So we cannot. This whole hadith science is highly unreliable. In fact, there's a decent video on YouTube with Dr. Josh Little and Jawad Hashmi about the 21 reasons why, Dr. Little has found the hadith to be problematic. And the contradictions among the hadiths is one of the 21 reasons that he gives. I think that video is well worth watching, even though the Dr. Little takes he just finished some work at Oxford University, I think about the age of Aisha, but he also has done some work on the hadith. So even though Dr. Little uses what he calls, I think, the critical historical method or something along those lines, I think he provides valuable insights. And some of these points were already made by some of the Orientalists, you see. Goldsheer and a few others. That there are serious problems in the corpus of the hadith. Let's remember also that the Prophet himself prohibited the recording of the hadith. There's one hadith in Sahih Muslim, hadith number 3004, where the Prophet allegedly said, if anybody has written down something what I have written, let him destroy it. Yes. And also you mentioned Abu Bakr. Indeed, he destroyed 500 of his own hadiths. And even Omar apparently scolded somebody for collecting hadiths. The Prophet prohibited writing of hadiths because he didn't want the hadiths to be confused with the Qur'an. And that's exactly what happened, you see.
Yes.
So unfortunately, we need to extricate the Quran from the hadith. You can keep the hadith as a sort of information about the past, but we cannot obviously treat it as equals. And even Tajab Rawani says we cannot put the Quran and Bukhari on the same level. This is really very, very problematic. And I am referring to it as a form of scriptural shirk. But of course, it gets worse when you start allowing the hadith to abrogate the rulings of Allah, the words of Allah, and replace them with rulings based on man-made narrations. Then you are falling into what could be referred to as a juristic shirk, right? Yes. You are allowing human beings to overrule Allah Himself. You are treating the human beings as judges with greater authority than Allah Himself. Now, if that is not problematic, I really don't know what is. But please help me out if I'm missing anything.
No, I agree. I've seen this. The Ummah is experiencing the evidence, the outcomes of these problems, which you're talking. I mean, this is what's happened to the Ummah and the loss of their dominion, the loss of their real moral and ethical guidance, and the lack of justice. As we've admitted, there's no book of justice in the Hadith. This is all the evidence of the outcomes, the consequences of placing the Hadith above the Quran. So I would like to continue this conversation and a bit of a focus on the madhabs themselves before we go further into the Golden Age and beyond. I like how this is developing. It has a natural flow, I think, according to the established fitra of and the purpose of our dialogue here. Alhamdulillah. So with that having been said, unless you have something else to add here, brother, let us close. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Until next week.
And wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.